Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, everyone, welcome back. Today we have a super involved and expansive wellness panel. We have different industry leaders from differing but overlapping perspectives and people who know each other, who have connected through this space. So I'm excited to welcome returning guest Andy McCurdy. I have Kristin Cox and Raquel Lackey. So I'm going to ask you all to go around the virtual room and give a couple-minute introduction to you, what it is you do, and we will start getting into all this wellness coordination, post-incident care, all the good things that we will get kicked off here. So why don't we start with the returning Andy McCurdy.
Morning, everyone. So my name is Andy McCurdy. I'm the currently Deputy Chief of Police for the City of Sumner in Pierce County, Washington. What's relevant, I think, to our conversation today, I've been a longtime peer support team leader, previously worked for King County Sheriff's Office for about 25 years, and a good part of that I was on the peer support team. Currently, I'm also a coordinator of a regional peer support team and also the team lead for an executive peer support team for law enforcement executives here in Washington. And so kind of when I talk today, I want to talk kind of on both ends, more on like kind of the administrative end about how we should organize and operate peer support teams and CISM response and so on. But also on the other end, kind of more my personal experiences as a person who received peer support care and also one who's provided it.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. I'm going to go over to Kristin next.
Hello, nice to be here. I am with Seattle Fire Department as a behavioral health coordinator, and I've been there for 4 years. And we're using a little bit of CISM in our broader peer support approach and even broader umbrella behavioral health programming, which is a subset of the wellness programming, right? Mm-hmm. And I come to this role after 30 plus years with the U.S. Coast Guard, running a 4-state team and specializing in multiple line of duty death responses, integrating with incident command, large-scale disasters, things like that. I've also been a peer support and critical incident stress management instructor for over, probably 30 years now.
Wow.
Nice. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristin. And this will segue. I was able to meet Kristin at a wellness-focused panel for Ski Patrol for a conference that I was invited into or brought into through the next guest, Raquel. So Raquel, thanks for the invite there. That was a fantastic panel, speaking to some of these themes and more, a lot of the overlapping topics. But Raquel, could you please introduce yourself?
Good morning, Eric. My name is Raquel Lackey. I have been a long-time volunteer with Hope Animal Assisted Crisis Response. We train the working dogs that focus just on crisis response and working with people after they've been in some stressful situations. I've had experience all the way from school shootings to the Oso mudslide with Kristin over 10 years and have recently started participating more of my time to support our search and rescue people.
Yeah, thank you. The listeners for sure will start hearing a lot of the overlap. We're talking about a lot of this holistic, multi-pronged approach to wellness, a lot of the hats that you all have worn as coordinators, firsthand experience being in the trauma with people, right, in the trenches, in that post-incident care directly as peer supporters, as people wearing that hat, also experiencing your own, also trying to facilitate other members and volunteers. And so as we talked before, and I'll tell the listeners, when we talk about post-incident care, it can kick up a lot of different ideas, a lot of different programs, teams, interventions, quote unquote. And really, I wanted to keep this conversation pretty unscripted because a lot of departments and teams and organizations and volunteer groups will all have different things. But my sincere belief and hope is that you will hear examples and concepts that you can find a way to apply it. So with that, that's the introduction. We started talking about a lot of these themes and overlapping concepts before the recording, which I had to respectfully interrupt because we have to capture all this. So Who would like to kick it off? When we talk about post-instant care, some people have given some examples. I mean, mass, large-scale critical incidents, and we're talking about school shootings, natural disasters, LODD, like line of duty deaths. These are some of the really hard-hitting, impactful ones that hit more than just a couple people that went on a call. They hit a community at large. So I kind of want to just open it up and see who wants to kick off. What are the things that we need to think about when we're interacting with our teams and organizations, and how do we attack this seemingly insurmountable task?
I can start, Eric. These
Yeah,
two are
please.
much more experienced than me, so I'll start at the basic level. A post-incident care isn't about fixing people, right? So while it's insurmountable, what they're going through is more about meeting them where they are and kind of helping their nervous system a little bit. So having a trained crisis response dog, that dogs provide comfort in a way that humans can't. Anywhere from being petted with that tactile experience to just a mere gaze helps us to start lowering our blood pressure and putting us in the part of our brain that helps us process what we've been through.
Yeah. Yeah. So well put. A couple things. One is that when you underline the not fixing. And a lot of times we as first responders and caretakers, we want to fix, like we want to make things better. We want to put our energy towards that. But I read it was Thomas More, one of his books, but allegory was kind of like a lot of times you go to a medical facility like for a physical injury or a sickness, and you just need rest, right? You just need fluids, or you just need like time. And sometimes there are people just in a hospital bed for a day or two. There's literally nothing that the doctor or the nurse or the care staff's like fixing. They're not like putting something on, or it's just they just need time to work it out and assistance in that. So I love that. And then the other thing I'll just throw out for the concept of emotional support dogs, for therapy dogs, even if you're not a dog person, like we've seen this like together, right? Where I'm a dog person, absolutely. I want to meet all the dogs. At the same time, you have people that aren't there for the dog, and they're almost trying to ignore the dog, but they can't. And there's something physiologically that they kind of get out of this, like, and I'm speaking for cops because that's what I see and that's what I am, but like they get out of their persona for a moment, and their shoulders come back, and they kind of relax, and then they breathe deeper, and then they bend down, and they kind of will like acknowledge the dog, maybe give a little like a polite pet, but then it becomes a lot more. And sometimes it's even like kneeling down and meeting the dog where they're at, or vice versa, allowing them to be met. And so that's just a little plug for what you and your organization do and others like it. So thank you for that.
Can I interject something? First of all, I just want to talk about my personal experience with Raquel. I can't remember specific. We worked together a couple times, but I remember. So I think like a lot of first responders, my go-to tool to cope with stress is to put my head down and get shit done.
Hmm.
And I think that that works for a time. But I also think that we need to have a place where we have psychological safety. We can drop our guard and we can really start to dig in and figure out what's really bothering us. I've been on your podcast before. I've shared my personal story, and I've just had a lot of like unusual series of traumas in my personal life and professional life that's, sometimes meant that I'm on the verge of the wheels falling off, right? And luckily, I've had a good resources to hold together. But I can't remember if it was a training or if it was a line of duty death response. And I was there as a peer support team lead, and I was trying to run like a circle. I think it was a training, and we were doing like a mock debrief. And Raquel came in with her dog, and that darn dog, made a beeline for me, sat down, right? And I just was like, I remember just having like a non-judgmental presence there. And it really makes me reflect back to when I do training on whether it be my specialty is interview of trauma survivors, right? And whether it's sexual assault, child abuse, domestic violence, homicide, right? And I think when we try to teach people how to be a non-judgmental presence, we do a lot of talk about active listening. And I think that's problematic for kind of hard charging type A people who have a tendency to put their guard up to cope with stress,
Hmm.
because I think you can apply active listening improperly if the entire time you're just thinking about your next smart question. And I think what animals do that's unique is that they are that non judgmental presence that's just there to provide comfort and psychological safety. My wife operates a clinic that does equine assisted therapy for kids with disabilities. And I watch how horses interact with kids and just kind of show up. And sometimes the kid is just brushing the horse and it's just calming to our nervous system. So when I was doing my master's project was on trauma-informed practices and how to teach that to police officers. And I looked everywhere for an alternative to active listening. And the closest thing I could find that I found helpful was something called neutral listening. And it was actually came from research around palliative care training for chaplains. Really what it talked about is how you just are absolutely present, lingering on every word the person's saying, paying attention to their nervous system and their body language, maybe mirroring what a healthy response would be with your breathing, with your posture, and so on. And what I've found to be most powerful, whether it be through a dog or a well trained peer supporter or just a trusted partner or friend, I think we just need to be there for people, right? And whether we're talking about wellness or whether we're talking about CISM, whether we're talking about hope dogs or whether we're talking about a structured and peer support team, I think that's the thing that's often missing when I go to agencies and their people are suffering is they don't have that place that feels safe and that person who's going to truly pay attention to them and where they're going to be seen and valued and supported in a way that you typically don't get in our profession and in our society. So
Yeah.
I
that's
couldn't
my
agree more with you, Andy. Like early on, we believed, talking immediately was always helpful, but now we know that just presence is more powerful than words.
Yeah.
That's my cue to jump in because I think in the last 10 years, I've started trying to weave mindfulness behaviors into that non-judgmental, equanimity, uh, and letting go of outcome expectations into peer support because I think that's the piece that balances that active listening versus the non-judgmental healing presence. And what we know from, you know, how people heal from trauma, or at least begin to heal from trauma, is they can't do it without being in relationship with somebody that is that fairly stable example of a regulated nervous system, right? And that's what we can train peer support to do. And I think that also, to kind of go back a little bit, I think part of what is inherent in what all of these programs that we're talking about can do is act as that presence, but also then support a community or a group of people or even individuals in reactivating their natural support system that for whatever reason may have kind of been strained or fallen apart or they just haven't tended to it. Because like Andy said, first responders, you put your head down and do, and everything else kind of sometimes falls by the wayside. I also think that in the Coast Guard, we used to say it was like coming alongside someone. You're not, when you have a disabled vessel, you come alongside, you don't necessarily tow them immediately. You basically are just offering them whatever it is they need. And sometimes you do have to lash yourself to them and help them steer. But that is, a serious crisis. Life is at threat. Kind of scenario. And then the other thing I think is really important that we've all been referencing but hasn't actually explicitly been said is that all these services, peer support, sometimes comes in and sweeps everything to the side and said, this is what we're doing. And really, I feel strongly ethically that peer support should always be voluntary. If somebody's life is at risk, then we need to make sure that they get safe to safety. All other peer support services should really be voluntary. If we're telling people what they should do, then it's much less likely to take root and be authentically supportive for them if they
Yeah.
don't engage, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Kristin. You hit on a lot of themes, and I want to kind of rewind back, or even with Andy a little bit, but like that neutral listening. And there's a overlap with the concept of neutral listening, also with the voluntary showing up alongside, right? So I think we can all resonate with the the idea of this like ship coming alongside, like not just going into tugboat mode like a lot of first responders want to do, which is like, what you need, what that person doesn't want to hear is that. And there are the examples where we need to override because it's life or death and it's that critical moment. We know there's that, but for the majority of cases, it's all along the spectrum of just showing up. And kind of like Raquel and I think others have said, it's not necessarily even knowing what to say. It's not about that. You don't have to say much. Sometimes examples that have been shared with me are just like, "Hey, I'm here. I'm here with you. I'm here if you want to talk. Here if you don't want to talk." We talked a little bit about texting and reaching out before, and we can get maybe more into like the nuance of that kind of relationship as we talk about that really important pillar. And sometimes it's just like, hey, no need to respond. I'm thinking about you. And then it might be a phone call and like, hey, nothing, no emergency. I'm just checking on you. Call me if you'd like. No pressure. And then maybe if you sense that somebody does need that, maybe you start getting a little bit more quote unquote obnoxious, right? So just a couple examples that come to mind when we talk about ways to show up and what that might look like.
I want to call out Raquel and her dog. Was it Pickles was your dog back then?
Yes.
So I still remember like one of the epiphanies I had in those moments was, that dog goes into a room and it quickly identifies the person who needs their support the most, right? And it says a lot, the fact that I was leading a debrief or at least an exercise for debriefing, and it went and found me, right? And I think that as peer supporters, we need to do a better job of differentiating the person who needs psychoeducation and general support from those who need very specific and intensive supports, right? And again, there's different ways to articulate this. One of the programs that I'm an instructor for is called the Community Resiliency Model. It's out of the Trauma Resource Institute. And I went through a kind of extensive process to become certified as a teacher in it. And the state sent me through that so I could come back and incorporate it into interview training for people investigating sexual assault and domestic violence. And what's really powerful to me is it's general wellness skills like we've seen in a lot of different settings, except we're very intentional about using what we call invitational language. So I'm not going to direct somebody to do something. I'm not going to direct somebody in what next steps there are, but I'm going to invite them to join me while I do some nervous system regulation skills. And that invitational language, like to Kristin's comment earlier, people are much more likely to follow through and do it if I invite them, versus if I direct them to do it. So I think that's an important lesson, and we need to figure out how to incorporate that.
Oh, we lost Andy for a second.
And that's where when
in and we'll have him
whether
back.
it's
I'm
like
sure.
West Coast post-trauma
But
retreats,
with
or
that,
if
it's
Warrior
the
Path
whole
or
thing
Struggle
of
Well,
people
those are
don't want to be
programs
told
where
what
we
to
invite
do,
people to join us in
and
this
especially
growth
us
and recovery
types, right?
process and strength-based
The
perspective
people
and
that
everything.
are seeking, the people that are rescuing, the people that are going to the danger. We don't want to be told, and it was already kind of nudged at, but you don't want resentment. We don't want defensiveness, and oftentimes it is meant out of good intention, and so it's just maybe just an awareness piece for us to look at and look out for in ourselves and for our peers that are in those roles too. It's not a bad thing. It comes from a good place, but how do we kind of harness that and pivot it away? A little shout out to Andy and others that are building that. You mentioned the executive peer support group, because if you think about when stuff hits the fan, it is coordinators, it is administrators that are trying to bring in all these agencies and do all this quote unquote fixing. And yes, that is intentional work. A lot of times it's necessary, but at some point there needs to be that decompress for those that are doing all this stuff.
One of the things that you're and both of you inherently, Eric and Andy, are talking about is that coming with the mindset of, like we do in the coaching arena, that people have everything they need to be successful and thriving and resilient inherently, internally. And our job is just to create a little platform or a space where they can play with that and discover it maybe and kind of remind them. And so one of the things, I've never been a first responder. I spent my whole career working with first responders and law enforcement, but I've always come to the table saying, I know you're resilient. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. You wouldn't have made it this far. And now might be a great time to just kind of remember the things that helps you stay resilient, because this job can take it out of you. And if you want it to be sustainable in a successful way, we want you to thrive, not just survive the career, right? Yes, we want you to survive, but we want you also to thrive and still have, your relationships outside of the job by the time you're done.
Yeah. Thank you, Kristin. You actually said something that reminded me. I wanted to kind of peel that back a little bit more. When you said about how we have those internal natural mechanisms and maybe they've been neglected, or maybe we've forgotten, or maybe they just haven't been brushed up on. Can you expand a little bit more for listeners? Like what types of things might come to mind?
So I'm going to use a story to do that. One of the things that we're doing in our department is we're using the Recess program, which is a resilience education to create sustainable support systems developed out of Denver fire area. Anyway, the big piece of that is they use the holistic wellness model, and it's a 2-page self-assessment that we do at the beginning. And what we're doing is walking people through that as part of a conversation, we're going out to the stations, to the different shifts, and just having coffee and visiting with them. Using the self-assessment, they don't have to report out, it's for them only, as a jumping off point for discussion. And every single time, it's usually the more seasoned, experienced people that talk first after we give them about 10 minutes to look this over. And they always say things like this: I realize I'm a little out of balance. I hadn't really been paying attention. Right now that I think about it, 20 years ago, if I'd done this, or even 10 years ago, this would have been very different. Maybe a month ago, this would have been very different. I'm out of balance in these different areas. I've forgotten, life has kind of taken over, and I've forgotten to do the things that I know are super useful to keep my nervous system regulated, to keep my relationships intact and thriving, to keep my focus and energy. And one of the biggest ones is as we were talking, I think before we started recording, is the importance of rest and recovery, and that is a productive piece of your plan, not a lazy, slacking piece of your plan. That is the part that makes everything else actually possible.
Yeah. No, thank you for illustrating those things. It makes me think of Kevin Gilmartin for the law enforcement group of emotional survival, but it's the ustas, right? Like, oh, I used to go golfing, I used to go hiking a lot. And those things are very regulating, right? Those things are very recuperative. On this peer support call very recently with Andy, where I love how, and this will go to the next topic, I believe, but to build a relationship, right? To build this common ground, it's just a roundtable of like, hey, like, what keeps you grounded, or like, what's kind of helping you stay right. And a lot of us are those doers. And I was one that was just, my processing was going to the gym really hard, right? And that served me until it didn't, because I'd be under rested, to your point, Kristin. I'd be over fatigued, I'd be overstressed, stressed from work, stressed from lifting heavy things, and my body wasn't regulating, and then I would generally get hurt and more burned out, right? Whereas like the struggle now, and Chris and I, we have a mutual connection, Matt Damniansik, who's been on this show before, but it's doing the hard thing sometimes is not doing the hard thing for us types, right? It's walking, like I shared, like it might sound silly to some people, but that's actually difficult for me to walk and not learn, not listen to a podcast, and even lately not listen to music, and not mind my heart rate, not try to jog, like no, just literally walk and just be there. And I've had a lot of things in my mind relatively recently, and some little mantras that I repeat to myself are sometimes like just like here now, here now. It's like left foot, right foot. And if that sounds difficult, then I challenge y'all to do a little bit of that. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. But no, thank you for
That's a good point, Eric. That's a great point. It doesn't take a ton of time. I think what I get in my head is like, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to set aside a whole hour. But what you just illustrated is pivotal. That takes 5, maybe 10 minutes. And that's what adds to our resiliency. And if we did that on a daily basis, like we brush our teeth every day. And I think on one of your podcasts I was listening to, you make your coffee and do push-ups with the counter or squats, right? While you're brushing your teeth. That's priceless stuff there.
Yeah. And it used to be a hard routine, and now it's like it's more journaling as I wait for the water to get, to boil, because that's what I need at this chapter. And so being able to adapt that and do what the quote unquote hard thing is probably not the thing you really want to do based on your routine sometimes.
Last statement sounds like the texts that you and I have on a regular basis. Do less, right?
Yeah. Do more. Yeah. If you know this about yourself, probably not the people listening to this, but like, some people at work, it's not do less, actually do more. But for a lot of people on this, it is know thyself and fight that routine sometimes. Yeah. And allow yourself to do less.
Super hard to do, to be a little bit vulnerable. I donated a kidney a year ago, and Kristin really helped me prepare for that, because I was in a panic of everything, the little things I do every day that I wasn't going to be able to do for up to a month. And, it took me a while to get down regulated, even, afterwards. And then looking back on that, what a gift that month was when she helped me step away and say, it's going to be okay to not do, focus on yourself to heal so that you can be. And it's a big gift that she did, and I'm very grateful.
Yeah, so shout out to both of you there.
So it's interesting, as first responders, the way we stay safe out in the field is by staying present in the moment, right? That's how we make good decisions. That's how we detect threats. That's how we make decisions about the next task that we need to perform, right? I think when you are present in the moment too much, it creates hypervigilance. And I think in our profession, we often mistake hypervigilance for courage. The reality is, if we aren't able to shift into that parasympathetic side of our nervous system on a regular basis to calm down ourselves, then it becomes really painful to be present in the moment, right? And I know for me, the most present symptom of my PTSD when I was still kind of living in that, before I shifted into more of a growth phase of my post-traumatic stress, was that it was painful to be present in the moment because my reality was painful. I was dealing with, severe medical problems with my children. I was dealing with terrible things going on at work, right? And so for me to be present hurt, right? And for me to be present distracted me from being able to make good decisions outside of, at work, at home, and things like that, right? So I think that when we start looking at the strength-based perspective or the growth mindset, and we start to train ourselves, and it's not about like that toxic positivity, right? It's when we start to develop positive resources that we can focus on. One of the things I love about that community resiliency model I talked about is we teach people how to track our nervous system, and we shift our attention inside our bodies, and we focus inside our bodies. We start to recognize the symptoms of dysregulation. And when we notice that our nervous system is dysregulated, we shift our attention outside of ourselves to something positive, to a resource, a person, place, or thing, or a spirit animal, or whatever it may be, that makes us feel joy, right? Makes us feel good about ourselves or the world around us. And then as we're focusing on that thing, we shift our attention back into our nervous system to feel that release of tension and joy, right? And I think for me, I went for many years without being able to feel joy, right? Without being able to even seek it because my present moment was painful. And I would work with a lot of first responders. It's often that critical incident is the straw that broke the camel's back. There's a lot of other stuff that they're holding on to that they're just barely hanging on. And then this critical incident happens and it's kind of pushes them over this edge to dysregulation that they're hard to recover from, right? I think, I have one of my daughters has pretty severe anxiety and depression and seeking treatment for it and everything. And she told me about a conversation she had with her therapist. And I thought at the time, I think she was probably 13. And she was really working on like it being in middle school, especially for girls, terrible experience, right? And she talked about how she would have trouble even walking down the hallway to her next class because all the people, all the noise, overstimulation, all that kind of stuff was really difficult for her. And so she came up with the coaching of her therapist, but on her own, she's like, I have trouble being present here and now. I'm trying to do bilateral stimulation drills. I'm tapping my legs. I'm, thinking about other things. But she said, I'm not going to let myself think more than 2 minutes ahead or 2 minutes behind me, right? It's because when we're not in the here and now, right, we're thinking about what's going to happen. We're thinking about what did happen. That's where we kind of get stuck in these cycles of negative thoughts and problematic behaviors that are resulted from it, right? And what I love, like community resiliency model, it's not unique. There's other systems that help with this. But again, teaching ourselves to recognize dysregulation, shifting away from it to something that's either neutral or positive, even during times of stress. And, whether it be with meditation or other wellness skills that help you do that. I think what I'm not really seeing that consistently and effectively being integrated into how we respond during a critical incident, right? And we talked earlier about CISM and CISDs. I've seen some new models coming out that are strength focused and based on positive psychology and growth mindset that I think are things that we need to do a better job at exploring. Because I think for me, that's what was always missing, right? And I would use my excuse and my crutch was always like, I would go lead these things to distract myself from dealing with my own struggles, right? And I think that's common among high achievers who want to do well and support their partners. So again, that's the thing. For me, like the big kind of watershed moment was when I went through Warrior Path and for me, unplugging for a week and going to a camp where I was completely disconnected from reality and focusing just on myself and recovery, surrounded by peers who could support me through that process. To me, that was transformational. And I think everyone needs to have that thing that helps them find that peace and joy.
Yeah.
Andy,
Did
I
you
think
find
you
that you
are
just needed that
right.
one?
I'm sorry, Andy, I think you're right on in what you're saying. And I also think that we can provide some of these skills and this education as people enter the career instead of waiting until they have an incident and then they have to figure it out, right? And I think we're doing a better job of that, teaching the window of tolerance idea that to be able to sit with distress and know how to regulate, know what the signs and symptoms are, and know what to do to get yourself out of dysregulation. And to expand that window of tolerance. I think those are all skills that are helpful for people that are coming in. And then also being able to kind of tap the brakes on your nervous system regularly throughout the day so that you don't go like this all day and then after shift have to, you crash to recover. I think all of those are prevention things that we can kind of weave into not just what we're doing, but how we do it, right? How we show up in the first responder world, which follows through to after an incident occurs or a personal challenge that people are, because in our department, at least, most people who reach out to peer support are not reaching out for the critical incident. They're reaching out for something that's happening. The wheels are falling off on their personal lives because they haven't done all of the things to regulate throughout the career.
Yeah, it's all life stuff, right? It's like the job in the industry certainly doesn't make it easy to deal with the already hard at times life stuff, medical stuff, family stuff, relationship stuff, financial stuff. Yeah, Raquel, what were you gonna say?
Just to highlight, I loved Andy's um, story about going to a retreat. And it's not just about doing it one and done, check the box. It's about how you're going to incorporate that multiple times into your life. And maybe it's not the extreme of a week away every single year, but what can you do to sustain that after you have a little bit of awareness? And maybe it's once every 5 years. Who knows what's right for you? We can build it to last.
It is
Yeah.
interesting going across the state and teaching peer support classes or helping different teams kind of develop. The vast majority of agencies in Washington state, whether it be police or fire, are very small agencies, right? And I didn't know how good I had it until I left King County Sheriff's Department, where we had a very robust peer support team. I helped start their wellness deputy position and supervised Sean Thomas when she was in that position as the first wellness deputy. But again, when I left that and I came down to Pierce County and we had a line of duty death that was critically impacted the whole region, then I started to really see like how good I had it in a large agency where they had really invested in that. I know here in Pierce County, we're trying to work to bring Struggle Well, which is the kind of outpatient, for lack of a better term, version of a Warrior Path. But it's a big investment for agencies, right? It's a 5-day course. You go home at night, unlike Warrior Path, where it's more of the intervention program where you stay there for a whole week. But again, it's about building that culture that supports people, identifies needs. The one criticism I have of Warrior Path and Struggle Well is they don't spend a lot of time talking about referring people to higher levels of care, which to Kristin's earlier point about prevention, intervention, postvention, it does a really good job on the prevention side, does a little bit on the intervention side, but that postvention, integrating people back in and making sure they have continuing care and stuff is the part that I think needs some more work. But I'm starting to see some progress in Washington State, but I think we need to realize, you know, knowing that the vast majority of agencies are small and don't have a lot of resources, we do need to figure out how to have a model that supports the people where they're at, right? And I think we're making some headway.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I'm going to take a moment to circle around some of these ideas, tie some things together that y'all are saying. And one thing that stuck out to me, Andy, was when you're talking about unplugging and giving yourself permission. A lot of doers, it's hard enough to do the 5 minutes, right? Or if we're like, hey, I'm gonna do this meditation thing or this mindfulness thing people are talking about, and then you're like, I'm gonna meditate so hard, right? I'm gonna crush this meditation, which is kind of usually counterproductive. You're like, man, I don't feel fully meditated. I need to do it harder. But when you said like you stepped away from reality, I'd even challenge like the words there because it's almost like, no, you had to face reality because you're busying yourself. And we know that workahol can be a really can be a really good drug, right? We're really productive. Dopamine's off the hook. We're so helpful, and it's good stuff. It's from a good place. However, it's not the full picture, right? It's not everything we need to do. So I applaud you for sharing that and a lot of your vulnerabilities. And that kind of brings me to that next point, which is like we're talking about introduction post incident. However, like you all have so beautifully illustrated that it's not about just the incident, right? It's the death by 1,000 cuts, and then here comes the sledgehammer or the machete that can you dodge or can you react to it? And it's like it's more than the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's like an anvil, right? And so, are you doing all the things to address the hypervigilance, to address the compassion fatigue? Do you have the peer support team or culture? Do you have the wellness programs that are more than policies, but they're in practice, right? Do you have this culture where people actually do take care of themselves, their health? They can de-stress, they can let the load off, right? They can have connection and relationship, right? Because to the point, and I guess like kind of what you just said, Andy, was when Deputy Collado was killed and you reached out because you have this reputation, you have these relationships, So although the machine wasn't built, you were able to quickly assemble and start building it with all the regional peer support and wellness liaisons and leads to figure like, okay, what do we have? And then you have, large organizations like King County that come in. You have small organizations that can pitch like one person or two people or a clinician, retired Seattle firefighter, Mike Washington, shout out to him, all these people coming together for this huge group that affected this huge multi-layered community. And so that's what I want people, especially that aren't from the region, to hear and recognize. You're like, oh man, like I have a small department, or we're just trying to build a peer support team. Cool. Like one thing that cops and firefighters or search and rescue are great at is knowing your people. And so just have those conversations, like get together, break bread, find those opportunities to collaborate on different projects and just start getting the thing going. And it's easier than ever to get a Zoom on the calendar, right? And that's something that you've demonstrated to you, Andy. So I appreciate y'all illustrating that. And then the last thing I kind of throw out that I want people to hear is that strength based approach, and that's what Kristin kind of kicked it off with saying, like as someone trying to help out, you're like, hey, like I know you're strong, I know you're resilient, and there's a lot of takeaway for the growing conversations in that. I'm learning a lot about how it's a very viable, effective means to interact with victims of crime. And a lot of times, like I love how chaplains have said this before, where hey, when your buddy gets hit or hurt or killed, like you're a survivor of homicide, right? Like you're now like this family, this friend of a homicide victim, right? And so to think about that, we get really uncomfortable with that, but that it's truly what happens, right? So we have to recognize that there's a lot that we can do for that. Acknowledge some of these different tools and how we can layer them.
I think what you're starting to approach, and Andy's probably going to take this over, is grief, right? Like there's all different levels of grief. And even the person that survives while your buddy, your partner got hurt, maybe he didn't die, whatever, but
Mhm.
there's a form of grief in there as
Yeah.
well. Of why me? Why didn't I have to go through
Mhm.
that? Right. And we all process that differently. Learning one about ourselves and given us permission to how we grieve is okay. It's not a prescribed linear process. I think is huge, and just have that conversation, which helps if you're in person breaking bread together.
Yeah, I feel like I owe you $20 for transition there because of what I was going to say. But I think one thing we also need to recognize is that oftentimes, we very narrowly look at our critical incident response to that incident. And I think we're doing a better job of starting to prepare people and so on. But I think that if we are going to show up for people in a critical incident, we also have to realize that we are likely to have people in there who have a very high level of need, right? And then, like for me, my family history, if I went through it, I have generational trauma. I have childhood trauma. I had cancer as a kid and kind of recovered from that. It changed who I am, rewired me, right? And as going through as a police officer, not only my personal life, with a divorce and a child custody battle, I also lost a couple of partners, line of duty deaths. I had some friends who committed suicide. I had all these things. And then my twins are born 4 months premature. And my son, we had, administered last rites a couple times in the hospital because we didn't think he was going to make it, right? And while I'm doing all this, I'm also a peer supporter. I'm also in a leadership position, having to make really difficult decisions and supporting other people while they're struggling, right? And so I do have a little bit of a concern if we're not using the strength-based perspective in our interventions. One of my criticisms of CISD is that in a group setting, sometimes it feels obligatory for people to attend or interact, and it shouldn't be. It should be invitational, right? But I think that we take people into their trauma and we tweak their nervous system a little bit, and that's a dangerous place to be. I do think one of the things I've been trying to encourage people to do is if we are going to do a debrief, when we kind of get to that fact phase, just as an example, a strength-based perspective, instead of just focusing on what we each did, why not recognize one of our partners and something they did that helped you get through it, right? And to
Mm.
me has turned these debriefs away from something where a couple people walk out very dysregulated and I don't even know it because they're so good at masking it. And now they don't get the care they need because they walk away and I didn't pull them in and make sure to support them and provide them the safety and care and love that they needed, right? But instead, I'm giving people another skill set, that resource, right? By knowing that one of their partners acknowledges them for showing up. I had one example of an officer involved shooting where an officer stepped in the line of fire and plated to provide protection to their partner while they administered aid to their another down officer, right? And that's that unspoken thing. And when you intentionally call that out in that group setting, that's, I think, shifts it from being possibly harmful to something that's, helpful for everybody involved. So, and again, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't call out a little bit, like we talked about CISM. I think if agencies cover that entire continuum of care from preventative, educational, systems-based, but also the destigmatizing, help-seeking behavior, all the way through a critical incident, also reintegrating people after, making sure they have ongoing care. That's the continuum. I think if we just focus on CISDs, it can be problematic. I do think in Washington State, I see the diffusings being used less frequently, and I think those are really powerful. And for those who aren't aware, diffusing usually occurs shortly after an event where you get everybody together, you provide a little bit of psychoeducation, you explore briefly what happened, and then you give them with information about how to keep themselves healthy, right? And I know Kristin can probably get into some more detail, but when we talk about PTSD, it's if those symptoms after an incident continue for too long, right? And the skills that you are trying to use to help yourself get through it aren't working, and you're still dysregulated and not able to live life in the way that you want to, right? And so again, if we really want to look at post-traumatic stress, start to recognize people who are injured and provide early care, that's really the way we prevent the disorder from occurring, right? But then also when we do have people who are experiencing disorder, we need to make sure that we have great resources available that they're willing to accept, and we help guide them through the options that are available so they can get the best care. And so I think that's what's missing. The science does not really support CISD. There are some kind of biased studies that look at the model, ICSF model, which I think is great. Some of the most powerful experiences in my career have been in a debrief setting. But I think the criticism is really, it doesn't do a great job of always identifying that person who needs a higher level of care and then making sure they get that.
And how the peer support team was trained, right? And the skill level of the clinician. So it's really just like any other human-based intervention. It relies on the humans doing what they should be doing, right?
Absolutely. And I think that it's fair if people haven't adopted a program where they use CISM, but there's these different aspects. It's like we're not saying bad, we're not saying good, bad, but monitor, be aware of these things, right? It's very nuanced sometimes. And yes, I have heard increasing conversations about how the very traditional model, if you follow the textbook and you're not intuitive with it, you could be in the certain instance exposing everybody else who had no idea, did not go in the apartment with the baby, right, to this tertiary or secondary trauma now, right? And you're walking them through their visceral experiences with that. That might not be helpful towards the person or others, right? That might be a more follow-up care with the clinician, right? The one-on-one. And so that takes nuance, right? But to recognize like it's a tool in the toolbox, there's different ways to modify it. I love the shout out to the defusings. So the more informal, hey, how do we get everyone together and you get that connection? Because shout out to fire, y'all have it forked out because you have to return to home base at some point. There's no dodging, there's not all that. So usually everyone will get back together at some point. Police are really good at hiding if they want to, right? You're in your car, you can go shag more calls, or you can go to a parking lot. So finding ways to make it work for your culture. Raquel, could I go to you?
I think that Andy bringing up the nuance or the doing the diffusings or debriefings with the intuition, I think that's a key message of what can make the crisis response dogs so invaluable. And you started that at the beginning of this podcast saying how Pickles came and alerted on you, right? She didn't do anything. She just came and sat with you at your feet. And so that's what we train them. We train them that to hone their skills of smell, which they're so good at, and to go towards that basically adrenaline dump or when somebody is suffering and the human doesn't usually pick up on it when the other person is shut down. They think that they're fine, right? They're fine. They're just sitting there. But watching that canine behavior and what they do and it's not just, one and done. Each dog does it differently and learning how the dogs are communicating. Ruffles, you guys have all seen how she's completely different than how Pickles was as her stoic self, but she still does the work. Bungie also is a third kind of person that would go to each and every person and check in while one of the sheriffs would be doing a debriefing at the end of a SAR mission. Yeah. And just trust your gut on what it's telling you.
And I just want to, Raquel talked earlier about grief. I think one of the problems we have in the group setting that, again, hope dogs do not do is that judgment because often that grief may be accompanied by guilt or shame, right? And I think that
Hmm.
if the guilt or shame is one of the underlying emotions that this person is experiencing, that group setting is not a great place to bring that up, right? The first time they kind of explore that emotion, it makes them feel very unsafe, right? And I've been in a number of circumstances, like a couple line of duty deaths of former partners of mine, that I had a little bit of guilt because I felt like I should have been there, or I had had specific interactions with them prior to the line of duty death, and I felt like, maybe if I had, you know, intervened earlier, done something else, then this line of duty death wouldn't have happened, right? If it's somebody who's known for reckless behavior or something, right? And so, I think that non-judgmental showing up. What I don't think is helpful is what I've seen some agencies do is, they go away to the 3-day ICSF training. They come back and they have their little script. In fact, I brought it with me just to have it handy for our discussion. They have their little script and they do their debriefing. They're like, okay, we're now going to follow the 7-stage Mitchell model: introduction, state purpose, state rules, guidelines, right? That is not helpful. I've even seen teams do that without clinical support. I've seen some that just have a chaplain, which in and of itself, religion can be triggering for some first responders, right?
Yeah.
For myself, I've rejected religion for a while because of my own experiences and questioning God or why certain things would happen to me or my family, right? So I think there's that nuance there about recognizing it's like showing up, supporting people, but then just being very careful about the circumstances that happened and the context of it, to not always just apply the same medicine to all these different conditions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go to Kristen because speaking to that nuance, right? You have a group of first responders or rescuers or helpers, right, that go to a thing. Maybe it's 8 people, or maybe it's a large scale event that affects literally everyone in the organization. So how do you meet people where they're at? You're the coordinator for such a large agency. Like, what are some things, and I know we could probably spend a whole another hour or multiple episodes on that, but what are some key things that you think people could think about, whether they're a wellness coordinator listening in, or whether they're a peer supporter or a sergeant, things of that nature?
So there's multiple levels, and you mentioned leadership roles. So I want to start there. I think educating leadership about what is and is not appropriate, and that it's not a cookie cutter. We're super fond of our protocols, right? And our SOGs. And so in our agency, for example, spending some time with the battalion chiefs that are the ones who press the button, hey, I think we might need peer support after this incident, to do a diffusing or have a peer visit, that it's not automatic, and that you can't order people to do this or to be there. Instead, by battalion chief, in our case, hitting the button for peer support, that initiates an assessment process, right? Where our lead peer coordinators say, hey, we'll check in, talk to the company officers or the commanders about what might be helpful. We might want to just do a low level stop by and visit. And if it feels like a diffusing would be helpful, we'll go ahead and do that, put the company out of service for a little while. But it's not automatic. And I think that part has been really helpful. And then educating in our case, we have shift leads that are part of our, whoever the coordinator types are, and educating them about, there's a whole assessment process that you need to be checking, and giving them a checklist to start with, but also, hey, talk to your clinical director or your lead peer or the peer coordinator, the head peer coordinator. I will tell you that I've been doing this work for a lot of years, 35 years. And I have responded to Hurricane Katrina and aircraft disasters and 7 line of duty deaths in one incident. And especially when there's something like a line of duty death or a suicide or a disaster, I go back to my colleagues who I worked with in the Coast Guard, and I say, this is what I got, this is what I'm thinking, reality check me, right? Don't ever feel like it's going to be the same as or
Hmm.
following a checklist. It has to meet people where they are. And then the ability to, call an audible if you have to in the middle of, like, this is our plan, not working. So I think that is an essential part. And if you don't have that in your own department or agency, that's fine, because there are a ton of people like Andy and Raquel and me and a whole bunch of other people that you can consult with. And we don't want to get in your business. We just want to be helpful and
Yeah.
and be somebody to bounce something off of, right? I'm not in the business of telling people what to do or how to do it, but I am in the business of saying, have you thought of this, right? Have you considered that? You might want to consider this.
Well, that's fantastic. Andy, do you have anything that you'd like to close with as we pull everything together?
Yeah, two things. I think we need to be intentional about how we apply wellness, peer support, whatever we're going to call it, whatever version or stage we're in with it. I think we need to be intentional, and I think we need to look at models that are working and try to replicate those as best we can, but also customize it to our individual needs. The intuitive side of it is we need to customize it to the individual needs of the people involved. I think more like holistically, we also need to adapt it to our organization and where we are, be self-aware about some agencies are not ready to implement, and bringing somebody else in to help may be good. The other thing I think is really important to address is the legality of confidentiality and privilege with peer support discussions. I know you have listeners across the country, maybe even internationally. Are you international now?
There's a couple
There we
international
go.
when I
All
last
right.
checked. Yeah,
I can't
definitely Canada. Or shout out to the north.
I can't speak to, so I am on a IACP group where we've been looking at peer support policy and making some recommendations. It's kind of all over the place. Most states have some sort of a law that provides confidentiality or privilege. Very few have both in the law. Just in general, just to clarify, confidentiality is established by agency policy. And that means that the conversation that occurs in a peer support setting is not, you're not supposed to share it outside of that one-to-one conversation, right? Privilege is the legal protection, which means that the peer supporter providing care cannot be compelled to testify about what they talked about. Washington State, most agencies have confidentiality in their policy. We do have a state law around privilege, but it is limited. We've had some case law here in Washington and then also like in Boston and some other parts across the country where agencies did not follow the law, and they either used people who were not qualified peer supporters, or that particular setting that they were used in was not appropriate, or they didn't have some people in the room that were not protected. And so I think we need to be very careful about making sure we know what the law says and follow that. When we set up our teams, I think it's important to have a supervisory or command level person on the team, maybe not to provide direct care to line level staff, but at least on the back end to help consult and organize. I think we also need to have competent clinical oversight of our peer support teams, right? Because I think there is a perspective there and also a time there when that clinical intervention is really important. And I've seen too many teams that don't have a clinician attached to their team to provide consultation when needed. So that would be my part. Follow the law, make sure that you have kind of supervisory perspective involved, make sure you have clinical support involved and that you listen to them, right? Not just listen to them when you want to. And I think that's how we kind of create the culture that follows, that protects our people, right? I also think it's important to recognize, and we could spend a whole podcast talking about privilege and what that means and doesn't mean, but just realize too that the protection in Washington State may provide protection if you follow the rules to one-to-one interactions with a peer. I'm not entirely confident it covers group settings. I'm also not confident that it covers if you get sued or charged criminally in federal court, because it only applies to state court. I do think there's some movement to try to solidify that, which could be helpful. But for the time being, I would say that start to think about the context and the type of event. I don't necessarily recommend group debriefings for officer-involved shootings anymore. It just muddies the water, particularly in agencies where officers are not providing statements about their involvement. And I don't want the first time for them to hear everybody else's version in kind of an uncontrolled debrief setting that can kind of change their recollection of what happened and so on. So again, I just think we need to be mindful about when we're applying which tool. And I think more often than not, that one-to-one clinical support that we really as a peer, most of our job is to identify people who need a higher level of care and then make sure that they get connected.
Yeah.
I'm going to add one thing to what you said. I think that it's really helpful. What we've had and other agencies have had as well as a code of ethics that a peer support person has to sign. And that's your way to, fire a volunteer because it's usually a collateral duty, right? Or if they're not abiding by that, if they're not abiding by policy, if they're not abiding by the code of ethics also, this is our standard of how we want you to show up for people, what you can do and what you can't do, not just policy, but how we want you to enact that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kristin. Anything else that you want to add in closing, Kristin, since we're with you?
Sure, absolutely. I think that all of these things are kind of woven in together. And that's why our conversation has been so rich, because there's so many little rabbit trails we could have gone down and probably talked for another 2 hours. The one overarching thing that I would like to infuse all of the conversations about wellness and peer support is I have, worked with first responders and been a family member of first responders for, 30 plus years. And compassion is first and foremost. In fact, most of the agencies have some, compassion statement in their values. And we see people, providing compassion to each other, to their families, to their friends, to the strangers on the street, even to people who are accused of things that they have to intervene with. And where I often see first responders pouring out all of that compassion and leaving nothing for themselves. And I think if we can keep reminding people that your well of compassion to be able to show up for everyone else begins with filling your own cup. And what I will sometimes say, because first responders don't want to put themselves first, I'm saying, okay, as long as you don't let yourself fall off the list, I want to make sure that you are also giving yourself the compassion to be a learning person, to be growing, to have made mistakes, to begin again over and over again, to show up for yourself. It's okay if you're not first, but don't let yourself fall off the list.
Yeah, no, thank you. I love how we're circling back to, Andy hit on organizational and kind of like procedure. Of course, you did DC. And then Kristin, yeah, it does come back to, all these things, but it does come back to the self. Like, how are you showing up and how are you going to do all these things that you intend to do without minding yourself as well? So thank you for that. Raquel, we're going to wrap it up with you.
For me, I think, post-incident care, I loved Andy's word intentional. It starts with what we intentionally do every single day to have that bucket full, like Kristin talks about, so that we have enough to be able to give to others while we take care of ourselves. And I want to hear them. I want the message of you're not alone. You're human. And whether it's through, formal peer support or the quiet presence of a friend or counseling or a certified crisis response dog team, healing just often starts with connection and reach out. And 99% of it is sitting there and being present with somebody here now.
I love that. Yeah, we talked about a lot of things and I agree. Like there's so much value in all the different topics and subtopics. At the same time, it comes back to the simple, easy, small steps that we can all build on. So again, I really thank you all. I love this conversation. And for the listeners out there, because we already know that we could have so many more conversations about this, you got questions, please send them over bluegritwellness@gmail.com. And maybe we'll reassemble the team, assemble Avengers. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.